My wife is not allowed to set foot in Seattle. The flight attendant said it softly, as she placed a neatly folded napkin in front of me. The plane was cruising at 10,000 meters. Outside the window, the rain looked thick and gray, almost solid. Beside me, Beatrice was asleep. Her head rested lightly on my shoulder, just as it had for 43 years. We were flying to our son's 40th birthday, business class. He had booked the tickets himself, and I had just been asked to pretend my wife was having a medical emergency. Before I tell you what happened on that flight, take a moment to subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. I read every single message, because what came after that whisper changed the way I see my family forever. I didn't look at the flight attendant right away. At 70, I had learned that reacting too fast often gives people exactly what they want to see. I folded the napkin again and set it on the tray table as if it were nothing more than a useless ad. Beatrice was still asleep. Her face was calm, a little pale under the soft yellow lights of business class. These past few months, her memory had slowed at times. The doctor called it mild cognitive decline. I called it something I could not afford to ignore. I looked up. The flight attendant stood straight, perfectly professional, no cracks, but her hand trembled. Just slightly. Most people wouldn't notice. I was used to noticing small things. "I think you have the wrong person," I said, quietly low enough that no one nearby could hear. She leaned down to adjust my teacup. Her lips barely moved. "Don't you recognize me, Judge?" My heart didn't race, but my memory began to stir. 15 years ago, she continued, you signed an order to suspend a foster care case. If you hadn't, I would have been sent back to an unsafe place. I studied her face again. Those eyes. I had seen them before, in a small courtroom in Chicago. She had been a thin teenager standing in front of me. I didn't remember her name, but I remembered that look. Fear, held together by dignity. "Don't look behind you," she added. "They're watching her." I had heard baseless warnings before, but her voice didn't sound like fiction. It carried the weight of someone who had thought very carefully before speaking. I didn't turn right away. I took a sip of tea, set the cup down, then slowly shifted, as if adjusting my legs. 2 men sat a few rows behind us. Both wore dark jackets. Neither spoke. One pretended to read a newspaper, but his eyes didn't follow the lines. The other stared toward the front cabin, with more focus than necessary. They didn't look like relaxed passengers on a rainy afternoon flight. I faced forward again. "You're saying they're waiting in Seattle," I said softly. "Who are they?" She didn't answer directly. "Why do you think this flight was reassigned to a private gate in the VIP area right after takeoff? Do you really think that was random?" I didn't like being questioned that way, but I understood. Thomas booked the tickets. Thomas arranged the birthday party at the seaside villa he had just leased long-term. Thomas had called me 3 times this past week, reminding me not to forget the family trust documents, just to talk things through while we're there. When a son starts caring too much about paperwork, a father should start watching. "Why do I need to pretend my wife is having a medical emergency?" I asked. She looked straight at me for the first time. "Because if she arrives there fully aware, everything will be out of your control. I don't trust vague words. I need facts." "I can't explain everything here," she said. "But I know those 2 men aren't just passengers. They were clearly briefed on your seats before boarding." "Briefed by whom?" She hesitated for a second. "A woman named Vanessa." My daughter-in-law's name dropped between us like a heavy object. Vanessa was always gentle, always eager to help Beatrice reset her phone so it's easier to use, always reminding me that Seattle would be better for my wife's health, that the sea air would help stabilize her mood. I didn't like how proactive she was, but I told myself I was getting old and overly suspicious. The plane shook lightly with turbulence. An announcement asked passengers to fasten their seatbelts. The flight attendant straightened up again. "I can't say more right now, but you need to decide soon. If you don't request an emergency landing, once we arrive, you won't have any chance to adjust the situation." I looked at Beatrice. Her hand rested on mine, thinner than before, more fragile than before. I had signed rulings that changed other people's lives, but this was the first time I had to weigh a decision that could alter my own family's fate. "You want me to create chaos in midair?" I asked. "I want you to keep control," she replied. Control. I taught Thomas from a young age that honor is not something you sell. I believed he understood that. I was proud when he started his own company, when he bought his first home. But over the past 3 months, he had talked often about temporary difficulties, about financial restructuring, about short-term loans. I offered help, openly. He refused. Vanessa said they wanted to be independent. So, why were 2 men watching my wife on this flight? I folded the napkin once more and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I won't request a landing, I said slowly. But I won't sit still either. The flight attendant's expression changed. No longer worry. Waiting. If you chose to speak to me, I continued, then I believe you know more than this. And I need the whole truth. She glanced quickly toward the back of the cabin. The 2 men were still there. After the lights dim for dinner service, she said, I'll come back. Don't let them see that you suspect anything. I nodded. The plane continued toward Seattle, cutting through thick gray clouds. I sat upright, keeping my breathing steady. There are whispers in life that, if ignored, leave regret behind. I refused to land, but I was beginning to understand. This flight was never just about a birthday party. The cabin lights softened as dinner service began. The quiet clink of spoons against plates moved in a steady rhythm, as if nothing unusual were happening at this altitude. I leaned toward Beatrice. Are you cold? I asked softly. She opened her eyes and smiled faintly. No, just a little tired. I held her hand longer than usual. I needed to feel that she was still there, still present, still the woman who had walked beside me for nearly half a century. Her memory lapses made me more alert, not less. They did not make her someone easily led, no matter what others might think. I excused myself and stood to use the restroom at the front of the cabin. One of the 2 men behind us lifted his head slightly. Just a glance. Enough to confirm they were not relaxed. I closed the door. The space was narrow and quiet. Beatrice's phone was in her coat pocket. I had taken it with me. Vanessa had reset it 2 weeks ago, saying my wife kept tapping the wrong apps. I didn't like it, but I hadn't objected. I turned the phone on. The passcode was still our wedding date. Vanessa didn't know that. The message folder was clean to the point of emptiness. Call history showed only a few familiar numbers. Too clean. I checked the voice memos. Nothing. But years of experience had taught me not to trust perfect surfaces. In the cloud storage, there was a subfolder that hadn't synced. I opened it. One audio file sat inside, named with a string of meaningless characters. 7 minutes long. I put on my earphones. Thomas's voice came first. Calm. A little worn. We're out of time. If this isn't resolved this quarter, the bank will freeze the entire project. Vanessa replied, her voice low, precise. I told you already. Your mother is the key. The insurance went into effect last month. All we need is a reasonable incident at the villa, and everything gets paid out. I didn't blink. Thomas was silent for a few seconds. I don't want this to go too far. No one does, Vanessa said. We're just creating a situation. She already has memory issues. We adjust the medication slightly. Deeper sleep. More weakness. No one asks questions. I stopped the recording there. There was no explosion in my head. No burst of anger. Just a cold, empty space. I thought back over the past few months. The times Beatrice said she felt unusually drowsy during the day. The new pills Vanessa insisted a doctor in Seattle had recommended. Thomas's calls, always circling back to asset restructuring for tax efficiency. I had told myself I was getting old, paranoid. I was wrong. I played the final part. Vanessa said, once it's done, we need her signature on the power of attorney documents. In that state, she'll sign anything you put in front of her. Thomas didn't answer right away. Then he said something that made me close my eyes. Dad will never agree, Vanessa replied. That's why we have to separate him. Don't let him control the situation. I removed the earphones. In that cramped space, I asked myself what I had missed. How could a child I once carried in my arms calculate like this? I had taught him about the law, about consequences, about the abuse of trust. I believed he understood. Maybe I had confused understanding with acceptance. I opened the phone again, checked the health app. Beatrice's medication reminders had been altered. The times were pushed back by 2 hours compared to the original schedule I kept at home. A small change, enough to cause prolonged exhaustion. I looked at myself in the mirror. A 70-year-old man, gray hair, eyes not as sharp as they once were, but still fully awake. I didn't feel afraid. I felt betrayed. I returned to my seat. Beatrice was awake, looking at me with a gentle, slightly unfocused gaze. "You were gone a while." "I was checking something," I said. The flight attendant appeared in the aisle, pushing the meal cart. When she reached me, she leaned down to adjust the tablecloth. "Did you see what you needed to see?" she asked quietly. "I heard it," I said. Her eyes changed. No more doubt. "I don't know exactly what they plan to do," she continued, "but I know they spoke with someone on the ground before takeoff. They requested a private exit and private transport." "Because they don't want witnesses," I said. She gave a slight nod. I leaned back. The pieces began to lock into place. The birthday party wasn't the center of the plan. It was just an excuse, a reasonable backdrop to explain our presence at a villa far from the city, a place private enough. I looked at Beatrice. Her eyes had closed again. "Have you been feeling unusually tired lately?" I asked. She thought for a moment. "Maybe. But don't worry. Vanessa said the new medication needs time." I nodded. But the decision was already made. I would not create panic in midair, as first suggested, but I would not let them guide us once the plane landed. "We're not moving to Seattle," I said softly, just loud enough for myself. The two men behind us looked our way again. This time they didn't bother hiding it. I understood that once the plane touched the ground, everything would accelerate. But at this altitude, I still had time. And for the first time since takeoff, I was no longer sitting still waiting for things to happen. I began to calculate. At my age, I no longer have the strength for reckless decisions, but I can still read the board. And this board was set at 10,000 meters, where there are no easy exits. I looked at the screen in front of me. The flight still had more than 2 hours before Seattle. Outside, the storm was moving north. The pilot had just announced possible severe turbulence during descent. Part of me considered requesting an emergency landing, but if I did it too early, I would be forced to explain. And if those two men already knew our seat numbers, they might also have been instructed to block any sudden change. I leaned toward Beatrice. "Can you trust me with something?" I asked. She opened her eyes. "You've never asked me that before. When we land, you may need to pretend you're weaker than usual, just for a short time." She studied me longer. Her memory might slow at times, but her instincts never had. "Is Thomas in trouble again?" she asked. I didn't answer directly. "I just want to make sure we keep the right to decide." She nodded slowly. Didn't ask anything else. I pressed the call button. Sloane arrived a few minutes later. I asked for warm water. As she leaned down, I spoke very quietly. "I need to know what they can control on this flight." She understood immediately. "They don't have access to flight operations," she said, "but they requested a private Wi-Fi connection. One of them is carrying an auxiliary transmitter. I can't call the police from here." "You can," she said, "but if they realize it, they'll act before we land. And then, I'm not sure who will keep control." I didn't like the word act, but I understood it wasn't harmless. I glanced behind us. The man by the window was using an iPad. He wasn't reading. The screen reflected chat windows appearing and disappearing. "Can you get them out of their seats for a few minutes?" I asked. Sloane thought, "If there's a medical situation." I gave a slight nod. "Then we'll create one." She looked at me, checking that I understood the risk. I had seen courtrooms where one wrong word shifted an entire case. But right now, waiting was the greater danger. I placed a hand on my chest and took a few deep breaths. When Sloane returned with the service cart, I leaned forward slightly, letting my breathing grow uneven. Arthur Beatrice whispered. I didn't answer. I let the cup slip from my hand. It hit the floor loudly enough to draw attention. Sloane reacted at once. "Sir," I clutched my chest, tightening my face as if bracing against pain. No need to overact. At my age, labored breathing and a change in color were enough to cause concern. The two men behind us stood up almost at the same time. "I'm a doctor," one of them said, moving forward quickly. I looked at him. "I don't need a doctor," I said, in broken phrases. "Just air." Sloane turned toward the crew at the front. "We need assistance." Within minutes, business class shifted into controlled chaos. Another attendant asked passengers to remain seated. The lights brightened. The man with the iPad set the device on his seat as he leaned toward me. He was too focused on watching me to notice Sloane subtly sliding the iPad toward the service cart. I caught it from the corner of my eye. "I just need a few minutes," I said, letting my head rest back. Sloane whispered, "We're going to take you forward for a check." They helped me up slowly. As we passed the two men's row, I heard one of them murmur, "Call downstairs." "There's a change." I memorized the voice. At the front of the cabin, Sloane led me into a small crew rest area. The door closed. She placed the iPad on the folding table. We have about 5 minutes before they realize. I opened the device. No password. The chat app was still open. The contact name was clear, V. The latest message read, "Make sure she signs nothing except the prepared documents. The lawyer will be standing by." I scrolled up. An attachment. Asset transfer agreements. Medical power of attorney. Everything filled in. Waiting only for Beatrice's signature. I checked the dates. They had been drafted 3 weeks earlier. "Can you send these files to me?" I asked. "How?" Sloan said. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small device. An old professional habit. An independent recording and storage unit not tied to any public network. "I need copies," I said. She connected the device with a spare cable. Within minutes, everything was transferred. Footsteps hurried outside the door. "They're getting suspicious," she said. I closed the iPad and placed it back exactly where it had been. Sloan took a breath and opened the door. I stepped out, keeping the look of fatigue on my face. "Just low blood sugar," I said, loudly enough for the 2 men to hear. "Old age isn't kind." One of them stared at me. "We can assist when we land." "I won't need assistance," I replied calmly. I returned to my seat. Beatrice took my hand. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I am," I said, "and I've just seen what we needed to see." The plane shook harder as it entered thicker clouds. The pilot announced worsening weather in Seattle with a possible delay before landing. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. They thought I was just an aging father pushed into a passive role. They forgot that I had spent 40 years reading lies, seeing through polite masks, and waiting for the right moment to reopen an entire file. The plane was still in the air, and the game had only just begun. The plane began its descent after nearly 40 minutes of circling above Seattle's dull gray sky. I looked out the window. The sea below was dark and flat, like cold metal. I had copies of everything they had prepared. But evidence only matters when it's used at the right moment. Sloan passed by. Her eyes paused on me for a brief beat. No words. I understood. The ground had been notified. When the wheels touched the runway, Beatrice gently squeezed my hand. She kept the look of fatigue, but not too much. We had agreed on that. She only needed to appear weaker than usual. Nothing more. The 2 men behind us stood up the moment the seatbelt sign turned off. They didn't rush, but their movements were too precise for ordinary passengers. I stood slowly, supporting Beatrice like a proper aging husband. The aircraft door opened not toward the main terminal, but to a private passage leading into the VIP area. I wasn't surprised. Thomas and Vanessa were waiting at the end of the glass corridor. Thomas stepped forward and hugged me. Just tight enough. Just long enough to look concerned to outsiders. I didn't return the warmth. "Dad," he said, his voice edged with worry. "I heard you weren't feeling well." "I'm still standing," I replied. Vanessa moved toward Beatrice, her hand resting lightly on my wife's shoulder. "Mom looks so pale. We should get her checked right away." I watched her eyes. Not concern. Calculation. "No need," I said. "We'll go to the villa first." Thomas exchanged a quick glance with the 2 men behind us. One of them gave a slight nod. "Dad, just as a precaution," Thomas said, "I've arranged a private medical vehicle." "You're very thoughtful," I replied evenly. Outside, a white vehicle was already waiting. No markings from any facility I recognized. The rear door stood open. Vanessa tried to guide Beatrice toward it. I held my wife's hand back. "I'll go with her," I said. Of course, Vanessa smiled. "But the family lawyer is waiting at the villa. We'll need to sign a few documents related to the trust, in case the care plan needs adjustment." I looked at Thomas. "A son's 40th birthday," I said slowly, "and the first thing you mention is paperwork." Thomas didn't avoid my gaze. "I just want everything to be clear." "Clear," I repeated. We got into the vehicle. The 2 men sat in front. Vanessa sat beside Beatrice. Thomas sat across from me. During the drive along the coast, no one spoke much. I noticed Thomas checking his phone again and again. Messages appeared, then vanished. The villa came into view after a bend in the road. Large, modern, separated from other homes by a line of tall trees. There were no signs of a party, no guests, no music, only cold white lights. The door opened before we could knock. A middle-aged man in a dark suit was waiting in the living room. Dad, Thomas said, "This is Mr. Keller, my legal advisor." I looked at him. "I've never heard your name." Mr. Keller offered a measured smile. We're only here to discuss protecting Mrs. Sterling's interests. Interests, I echoed. Beatrice was guided to the sofa. Vanessa handed her a glass of water. I think Mom should rest for a bit, she said. Meanwhile, you and Thomas can sign a temporary medical authorization, so in case of an emergency, we can make decisions on her behalf. I took the folder placed in front of me. I had already seen its draft on the iPad. The only difference now was that Beatrice's signature line was still blank. Why does this require full trust authority? I asked, turning to the last page. Thomas took a breath. It's just a precaution. A precaution against what? Against the possibility that Mom loses full cognitive capacity. The room went silent for a few seconds. I set the folder down. Thomas, I said for the first time, using his name without any warmth, how long have you been preparing this? He looked at Vanessa before answering. You're misunderstanding. I rarely misunderstand. Vanessa stepped in, her voice still gentle. Dad is tired. Maybe we should let Thomas explain later. I'm very alert, I replied. I took the small device from my inner pocket, the same one I used on the plane. I placed it on the table. I didn't turn it on. I heard your conversation, I said. Thomas froze. Vanessa didn't blink. What are you talking about? Thomas asked. I'm talking about the insurance, about adjusting the medication, about the plan to separate me from my wife. Vanessa let out a soft laugh. You're imagining things. I copied the files from the device your people brought, I said, including this transfer agreement. Thomas shot to his feet. You had no right to access. I have the right to protect my wife. I cut in. No one spoke. Beatrice remained seated, eyes closed as if exhausted. But I knew she was listening. I'll sign, I said suddenly. Thomas and Vanessa both looked at me. But before I do, I continued, I want to hear from your own mouths that this has nothing to do with your company's financial situation. Thomas shook his head. No, and nothing to do with the insurance policy activated last month. Vanessa's hand tightened on the armrest. I want to hear it, I said again. The room grew heavy. I didn't need them to shout or attack. I only needed one more wrong sentence, because outside the villa, others were waiting. And this time, I wasn't the only one prepared. The room stayed quiet long enough for me to hear the wind striking the glass behind me. Thomas broke the silence first. You're making too much of this, Dad, he said, his voice no longer calm. I'm just trying to protect the family assets. If something happens to Mom without proper authorization, everything falls apart. Family assets, I repeated. Or your loan? Vanessa stood up. We don't have to keep going like this. If you don't trust us, we can cancel everything. No, I said. We'll continue, but we'll do it clearly. I turned on the recorder on the table. A dry click cut through the room. I want you both to confirm, I said slowly, that there is no insurance policy set up around your mother's health. Thomas looked at Vanessa. She said nothing. Answer me, I said. Thomas swallowed. There is insurance, he said quietly. But it was a reasonable financial decision. And the medication changes, I asked. Just to help her sleep more deeply, Vanessa replied. She's always been anxious. I checked the original prescription, I said. Those adjustments didn't come from her doctor. No one denied it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't hit the table. I simply let the silence stretch once more. Thomas, I said, how long have you been planning this? He sat back down, the confidence gone from his face. I didn't see another way. The company was collapsing. Without that payout, we would lose everything. Lose everything, I repeated. And so you were willing to break your own family. I never meant to hurt Mom, he said quickly. Just create a situation. Then things would be controlled. I looked at him for a long moment. A man in his 40s. Yet in that instant, I only saw a frightened child who had chosen the wrong road. Beatrice opened her eyes. She sat up straight. The fatigue was gone. Vanessa stepped back on instinct. You think I didn't notice? Beatrice asked, her voice soft but steady. The pills that made me unusually drowsy. The conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room. Thomas stared at her, as if seeing the impossible. Mom, he whispered. I've been more aware than you think, Beatrice said, and your father didn't miss a thing. I stood. Outside, I said. There are representatives from the Financial Investigation Unit and 2 airport security officers. They're not here to make a scene. They're here to document. Vanessa went pale. You called them in advance. I only made sure that once the truth was spoken, it couldn't be erased. The front door opened quietly. 2 people stepped in, calm, unhurried. They introduced themselves briefly and asked to see the relevant contracts. Thomas didn't resist. He sat still, his hands clasped together. I didn't look at my son as the documents were collected. I looked out at the ocean through the wide glass window. The waves moved steadily, unaware that a family had just cracked itself open. I didn't want to see my child taken away in chaos. But I also refused to cover up what had happened. "Dad," Thomas said as he stood at the investigator's request. "Can we stop this here?" I turned back. "You went too far," I said. "I'm only stopping where the truth begins." He lowered his head. Vanessa said nothing. After they left the house, the room felt strangely empty. Beatrice sat down and let out a quiet breath. I sat beside her. "Do you regret not getting off the plane?" I asked. She shook her head. "If we had stopped halfway, everything would only have been delayed. At least now, it's exposed." I held her hand. That night, we didn't stay at the estate. I called our private family attorney. Every trust was reviewed. Protective clauses were added, ensuring no one could make unilateral changes as long as either of us remained clear-minded. A few months later, I decided to use most of the assets I had once planned to leave to Thomas, to create a new fund, a fund to support elderly people who are financially manipulated by their own families. I didn't do it to punish my son. I did it because I saw a gap in the legal system, where older people are treated as weak simply because they trust. Thomas later faced the legal consequences of his choices. I didn't interfere. I didn't add fuel to the fire. I simply refused to shield him. 1 year later, I received a handwritten letter from him. Not asking for money, just an apology. I haven't replied. I don't know what the future holds between us. But I know one thing for certain. A father's love cannot survive without truth. That night, as Beatrice and I flew back to Chicago, she rested her head on my shoulder. "You once said," she whispered, "that legacy isn't about money." "I remember," I said. I looked out the window. The night sky was calmer than before. The greatest legacy a father leaves is not the money he gives his children, but the boundaries he is brave enough to hold. And sometimes it all begins with a single whisper we choose not to ignore. If my story made you think, if it made you look again at the relationships you once felt were completely safe, then perhaps it has done what it needed to do. Family is where we place our deepest trust. But trust does not mean closing our eyes. Love does not mean giving unlimited power. And protecting the people we love sometimes means not staying silent, but having the courage to speak the truth, even when that truth hurts. If you believe stories like this need to be told, to remind us of responsibility, awareness, and self-respect, please subscribe to the channel. Share this story with someone you care about, and if you feel it deserves it, leave a like as a sign of support. Because sometimes one warning heard at the right moment can change an entire family.